In the first 14 months of the 1930s, approximately 60 men were killed in New York streets, restaurants, and back rooms, in a conflict that would not have a proper name until historians gave it one decades later. What those 14 months produced was not merely a new set of bosses, they produced a new institution, one designed to prevent that kind of war from ever occurring again. The institution held for 5 decades, and then it did not. Tonight's list covers 5 wars that did not simply produce casualties. They produced structural change. The conflicts ranked here are distinguished not by their body counts alone, but by what they altered permanently, in the way organized crime in America governed itself, in who held power, and in how that power was eventually dismantled. Each war on this list is documented in federal court records, FBI files, or the established work of recognized organized crime historians. The primary sources are Selwyn Raab's 5 Families, the most comprehensive documented history of New York's crime families, FBI files released under the Freedom of Information Act, and the federal trial transcripts from the major RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s. Rankings are determined by the scale of the structural consequence each conflict produced, not by body count alone, but by what was permanently changed when the shooting stopped. 5 wars, beginning with number 5. Number 5, the Gallo-Profaci War, 1961 to 1963. By the winter of 1961, Joseph Profaci had been the boss of the family that bore his name for 3 decades. He had built a durable position in Brooklyn, survived the transition from Prohibition, and maintained a standing within the commission that few questioned openly. What a faction inside his own family questioned was something considerably more specific: the distribution of the family's earnings. Joseph Gallo, born in Brooklyn in 1929, a member of the Profaci family since his early 20s, had reached a conclusion, along with his brothers Larry and Albert, that Selwyn Raab documents in 5 Families, that Profaci was extracting an unusually large share of the family's tribute, while returning proportionally less to the men generating it. Gallo and his associates decided to press that grievance through the only leverage immediately available to them. In February 1961, the Gallo faction abducted 4 of Profaci's senior figures, including his underboss and several capos, and held them as collateral against a renegotiated internal arrangement. The terms were agreed to. The hostages were released. Profaci then delivered nothing he had agreed to. The resulting conflict lasted from early 1961 through 1963 and produced approximately a dozen killings on both sides. Neither faction achieved a decisive military result. The Gallo faction was numerically outgunned. Several of their members were killed or imprisoned. Gallo himself was convicted on extortion charges in 1961 and began serving a 10-year sentence that effectively removed him from the war's active phase. Profaci died of cancer in June 1962 without resolving the conflict he had set in motion by reneging on his agreements. His successor, Joseph Magliocco, inherited both the war and the family's unresolved internal tensions. Magliocco died in December 1963. The war concluded without a settlement. The structural consequence became apparent over the following years, rather than immediately. What the Gallo-Profaci conflict demonstrated, for the first time at scale within the 5 families, was that the Commission's governance model had no reliable mechanism for resolving internal disputes below the boss level. Men within a family could wage a sustained war against their own leadership, and the Commission could not stop it. That lesson was absorbed and applied again with increasingly severe consequences in the decades that followed. Joey Gallo was released from prison in 1971. On April 7, 1972, he was shot and killed at Umberto's Clam House in Manhattan during a late-night birthday dinner. He was 43 years old. The killing is attributed in the documented historical record to Colombo family loyalists, the settling of accounts from a war that had technically ended nearly a decade earlier. Number 4. The Bonanno War, the Bonanno family civil war, 1964 to 1969. The conflict inside the Bonanno family in the mid-1960s began not with a rebellion from below, but with an act of aggression from the top, an assassination plot directed outward, toward the commission itself, that was discovered before it could be executed. According to Selwyn Raab's account in 5 Families, supported by FBI surveillance records of the period, Joseph Bonanno communicated to Joseph Magliocco, then serving as acting head of what had been the Profaci family, a plan to eliminate 2 sitting commission bosses, Carlo Gambino of the Gambino family, and Thomas Lucchesi of the Lucchesi family. Magliocco contracted the murders. The man he retained for that purpose, Joseph Colombo, went directly to Gambino and disclosed the plot. The commission's response was swift and efficient. Magliocco was summoned, confessed, was assessed a significant financial penalty, and died of a heart attack in December 1963, before further consequences could be administered. Bonanno was summoned separately to answer for his role. He did not appear. On the evening of October 21, 1964, Bonanno was seized on Park Avenue in New York and disappeared from public view. He claimed kidnapping. Most organized crime historians who have examined the episode, Raab among them, have concluded that the disappearance was staged, either to evade the commission's judgment or to create operational space for a period of reorganization, or both. Bonanno eventually resurfaced in Arizona, conducting his affairs at a deliberate remove from New York. The commission responded by endorsing a rival claimant for control of the family. Gaspar di Gregorio, backed by commission authority, challenged Bonanno's son Salvatore for control of the Borgata. The conflict between loyalist and commission-backed factions produced what now appears most frequently in the documented record of the war, an ambush on Troutman Street in Brooklyn on January 28, 1966, in which Di Gregorio's men opened fire on a gathering of Bonanno loyalists. According to FBI surveillance records of the period, no one was killed. The failure of the ambush severely damaged Di Gregorio's credibility, and the Commission's ability to impose its preferred resolution never recovered. The structural consequence was lasting. The Bonanno family was suspended from Commission membership, one of the only times in the Commission's history that a founding family was effectively expelled from its governing body. The family spent the following 2 decades in a state of institutional degradation that created conditions for something that had never previously occurred: the successful long-term penetration of a major crime family by an undercover federal agent. FBI Special Agent Joseph Pistone, operating under the identity of jewel thief Donnie Brasco, worked inside the Bonanno family from 1976 to 1981. His operation, documented in his published account of the same name and in the federal prosecutions that followed, was made possible, in part, because the family's internal vetting procedures and organizational controls had been weakened by a decade of civil war. The Bonanno family, that had been among the most stable of the 5 families in 1963, had become, by the early 1980s, the most thoroughly compromised. Bonanno himself retired to Arizona, published a memoir in 1983, and died in 2002 at the age of 97. The family that bore his name spent the following 4 decades as the most penetrated and most frequently prosecuted of the 5 original New York families. Number 3. The Second Colombo War, 1991 to 1993. By the time the Second Colombo War began, the family had already inherited the unresolved institutional damage from the Gallo-Profaci conflict 30 years earlier. What it now faced was a leadership dispute that unfolded almost entirely within the observation of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Carmine Persico, the Colombo family boss, convicted in 1986 as part of the commission case, the federal prosecution formerly titled United States versus Salerno, was serving a federal sentence exceeding 100 years. He had never relinquished operational control of the family from his prison cell. That fact is documented in FBI surveillance summaries and was acknowledged in subsequent federal proceedings. His designate for day-to-day operations was Victor Orena, appointed acting boss in 1988. Orena's interpretation of that arrangement and Persico's interpretation were not compatible. According to FBI intelligence reports and the federal indictments that followed the war, Orena had concluded that Persico's permanent incarceration made the arrangement permanent in practice, and that formal succession should follow accordingly. Persico concluded that Orena's authority was temporary and conditional, and that the Persico family's control of the Borgata was not a matter for negotiation. The mechanism that might have resolved such a dispute, the commission, did not exist in any functional form in 1991. The commission case convictions had removed the senior leadership of all 5 families from the street. There was no arbiter remaining. What followed was approximately 2 years of shootings across Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Long Island, documented in FBI surveillance records, federal indictments, and Raab's account in 5 families. Men on both sides were killed. Operational planning on both sides was observed and recorded by the FBI, which had not reduced its surveillance of the Colombo family in the years since the commission case. The structural consequence was the effective end of the Colombo family as a functioning criminal enterprise. Both factions' leadership was imprisoned as a result of the prosecutions that followed the war. The family that had survived the Gallo-Profaci conflict, the internal violence of the 1970s, and the commission case had conducted a second civil war in plain view of federal investigators and provided them the documentation to complete its dismantling. As Raab documents in 5 Families, no other major American organized crime family so thoroughly destroyed its own institutional capacity through internal violence in the RICO era. The Second Colombo War was less a conflict between criminal factions than a years-long confession, conducted in bullets, to a federal audience that was watching. Number 2. The Castellano assassination and its aftermath. December 1985 to 1987. At approximately 5:25 on the evening of December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano was shot and killed outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan. His underboss, Thomas Bilotti, was killed alongside him. Castellano was 69 years old. He had been the boss of the Gambino family since 1976 and was, by the documented assessment of federal law enforcement of the period, the most powerful organized crime figure in the United States at the time of his death. The killing was ordered and orchestrated by John Gotti, then a Gambino capo, without the authorization of the commission. This fact is documented in the federal indictments that followed, in FBI surveillance records of the period, and is analyzed at length by Selwyn Raab in 5 Families. Its significance within the documented history of American organized crime cannot be overstated, because the foundational protocol of the commission, established in 1931, maintained through 5 decades of internal governance, was that a sitting boss could not be killed without commission approval. Gotti had done it without asking. Gotti's assumption of the Gambino family leadership that followed was conducted outside any commission sanction. The FBI accelerated its investigations of the Gambino operation. Gotti's deliberate pursuit of public attention, the tailored suits, the media appearances, the 3 acquittals in the late 1980s that generated the characterization, the Teflon Don, produced both notoriety and a substantially heightened level of federal surveillance. By 1991, Salvatore Gravano, Gotti's underboss, was cooperating with federal prosecutors from a federal holding facility. Gravano's subsequent testimony, which addressed the Castellano murder in specific operational detail, formed a central element of the prosecution that convicted Gotti on 14 federal counts, including murder. In April 1992, Gotti was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in June 2002. The structural consequence of the Castellano assassination extended well beyond the Gambino family. It demonstrated, in the most direct possible operational terms, that the Commission's authority had eroded past the point of enforcement. A capo had killed the most senior boss in the country without seeking permission from anyone, claimed leadership of the largest organized crime family in the United States, and held that position for 6 years. The institution designed specifically to prevent unilateral power seizures of precisely that kind had proved incapable of preventing one. The commission case, United States versus Salerno, had already produced convictions against the leadership of all 5 families in November 1986, establishing in federal law what the Castellano murder had demonstrated in operational fact. The commission was real, it had governed, and the institution was broken. The Castellano assassination did not merely mark the end of a specific boss's tenure. It made visible, to everyone who understood what the Commission's rules required, that those rules no longer had an enforcer. Number 1. The Castellammarese War, 1930 to 1931. Every structure documented in the 4 entries above, the Commission, the protocols around boss succession, the rule against killing a sitting boss without collective authorization, the concept of a governing body with binding authority over the families, was created by the conflict ranked first on this list. To understand what the 4 wars above destroyed, it is necessary to understand what this one built. In 1929, American organized crime in New York was not an institution, it was a competition without governance. On one side, Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, who had consolidated a dominant position in New York's Italian-American criminal networks across the 1920s, through a combination of organizational capacity, and the willingness to use lethal force that made him the closest approximation of a single authority in the city's underworld. On the other side, a faction composed primarily of immigrants from Castellammarese del Golfo, a town on the western coast of Sicily, led by Salvatore Maranzano, who contested Masseria's supremacy and drew to his cause a significant portion of the Sicilian-born men who had not established themselves within Masseria's structure. The war that began formally in 1930 is documented in its broad outlines by FBI investigators in the years that followed, and its history was subsequently assembled by Selwyn Raab in 5 families from available investigative records, federal court testimony, and historical scholarship. Raab documents the war's toll at approximately 60 men killed across its 14 months. The killings occurred in New York's streets, restaurants, and social clubs, and extended in several instances to affiliated networks in other cities as the conflict drew in the larger structure of Italian-American organized crime beyond New York. The principal architect of the war's resolution was not the man who won it in any conventional military sense. It was Charles Luciano, at that time a senior figure within the Masseria organization, who determined that the conflict's continuation served no one's interests, and who engineered the sequence of events that ended it through deliberate betrayal rather than decisive military victory. On April 15, 1931, Masseria was shot and killed at the Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant in Coney Island. He had gone there to dine with Luciano. Luciano left the table at some point before the shooting. The gunmen were never officially identified in the documented record, though FBI investigative files and the accounts of recognized organized crime historians have named the individuals widely believed to have carried out the killing. The murder ended the war's first phase and transferred Masseria's organizational authority to Maranzano, the surviving contender. Maranzano then convened a large gathering of Italian-American organized crime figures. The meeting is referenced in subsequent FBI accounts and cooperator testimony as one of the first organized summits of the modern era, and declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He established a formal organizational hierarchy: boss, underboss, capo, soldier, associate. He placed himself at the apex of it. He then began planning the elimination of Luciano and several other figures he regarded as threats to his position. On September 10, 1931, approximately 5 months after Masseria's death, a team of men entered Maranzano's offices in the New York Central Building on Park Avenue, identified themselves as federal agents, and killed him. Luciano had arranged the killing. In a period of less than 5 months, Luciano had maneuvered himself into position to eliminate both the man he had served and the man who had replaced him. What Luciano built in the months that followed is the reason this war ranks first on this list. He did not assume the title of capo di tutti capi. He abolished the position entirely. What replaced it was the Commission, a governing body in which the heads of the major families held collective authority, in which no single boss held supremacy over the others, and in which the foundational decisions about the institution's direction required collective agreement. The structural innovation was designed to solve the specific problem the Castellammarese War had made lethal: the absence of any mechanism for resolving disputes between powerful men short of killing them. The Commission Luciano, established in 1931, governed the major structural decisions of American organized crime for the following 50 years. Its authority was neither absolute nor perfectly maintained. The 4 wars ranked below this one demonstrate with precision the limits of what it could enforce. But as a mechanism for containing the kind of all-out conflict that had killed approximately 60 men in 14 months, it functioned. Federal prosecutors who built the Commission case in the 1980s, which resulted in convictions against the bosses of all 5 New York families in November 1986, established in federal court what historians had long documented: the Commission had been real, had governed, and had operated as a criminal conspiracy within the meaning of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act of 1970. The 60 men who died in the Castellammarese War's 14 months died in a conflict between 2 individuals, neither of whom survived it, over a structure that did not yet exist. What replaced both of them governed American organized crime for half a century. The men who fought the Castellammarese War, and every individual documented on every list in this series, represented a small criminal minority within the Italian-American community of their era. The broader Italian-American community built the infrastructure of this country, served in 2 world wars, founded institutions and industries that continue today, and has nothing to do with the conduct documented in these files. That distinction is not incidental. The criminal organizations covered by this channel are not the story of Italian-American culture. They are the story of a small number of men who operated at its criminal margins. 5 wars, 1 founding conflict, that produced a structure designed to prevent such conflicts. 4 subsequent wars that tested, eroded, and ultimately confirmed that no institutional design outlasts the will of the men charged with enforcing it. The commission lasted 50 years. What replaced it has been documented in federal courtrooms ever since. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The 5 family files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. This has been the 5 family files. Good night from the archive.